they branded 28-year-old Violet Crane a poisoner, nailed a sign above her door that read "Murderess," and left her to rot in the August heat while her husband's family stripped the house bare around her. But Violet had poisoned no one. In the summer of 1889, in the dying copper town of Harrow's Bluff, Nevada, a man named Judge Prentice Ord used one grieving widow's silence to bury a secret that would have destroyed his own bloodline. The poison that killed Edmund Crane had been meant for someone else entirely, and the man who had brewed it still walked free, still sat at Ord's dinner table every Sunday, still smiled at Violet through the window of the jailhouse, where they had locked her without trial. What Judge Ord did not know was that a widowed cattle broker named Cal Merritt, a man who had buried his son 2 seasons past and hadn't spoken more than 20 words to any living soul since, would ride through Harrow's Bluff on his way to nowhere in particular, see the sign above that door, and stop his horse. This is their story. A tale of a woman her town called guilty, and the man who chose the harder road of believing her. Violet Whitmore Crane had come to Harrow's Bluff as a bride 3 years earlier, following Edmund Crane west from Ohio with a trunk of linen and no illusions about hardship. Edmund was kind enough, quiet, a man who worked copper claims and kept careful ledgers. They were not a love story, they were a partnership, and a decent one. But Edmund had a cousin named Fletcher Ord, nephew to the judge, and Fletcher had wanted the Crane claim since before Edmund ever filed the paperwork. Edmund died on a Thursday in late July. The doctor said it was arsenic. Fletcher Ord told his uncle it was Violet's doing. By Friday morning, the sign was up. Violet sat in the back room of what had been her own home, her wrists bound to the chair with rope, the front door nailed shut from the outside. She was not in a proper jail, because Harrow's Bluff did not have a proper jail. She was in a room she had painted herself the previous spring, the color of sage, with curtains she had sewn from flour sacking. Now those curtains were gone. Fletcher had taken them, along with the good dishes, the clock from the mantel, and the deed to the claim filed under Edmund's name. The townspeople of Harrow's Bluff were not cruel people. That was the particular misery of it. Mrs. Adeline Pratt from the laundry kept walking past the window and not looking in. Hector Blythe from the assay office crossed to the other side of the road. Reverend Cushing visited once, prayed at the doorstep without entering, and did not come back. They were frightened people. Judge Prentice Ord held the water rights to every claim within 12 miles. He controlled the freight contracts. He decided who got credit at the supply house and who went without. In Harrow's Bluff, angering Ord did not mean losing a friend. It meant losing everything. Violet understood this. She had watched it work on Edmund in the last year of his life. The slow way a man shrinks when he owes more than he can pay to someone who enjoys the owing. On the second morning, a boy named Pete Stills, maybe 12 years old, the laundress's son, came to the side window with a tin cup of water hidden under his shirt. He pushed it through the gap at the bottom of the sash. Violet drank it on her knees, her bound hands barely able to grip the cup, and when she looked up to thank him, he was already gone. That small mercy kept her from breaking entirely. On the third morning, Cal Merritt rode into Harrow's Bluff. Calvin Merritt was 44 years old and looked older. He had been a cattle broker out of Elko for 20 years, a man with a good reputation and a solid operation, until the winter of 1887 took his son. Robbie had been 16, caught in a blizzard coming back from the eastern pasture. They found him 3 days later. After that, Cal sold off most of the herd, kept a small parcel of land he couldn't bring himself to deed away, and started drifting. Not aimlessly. He still worked, still honored contracts, still paid his debts, but there was no direction to him anymore. He moved because stopping felt worse. He was passing through Harrow's Bluff on his way to a broker meeting in Carson City that he half intended to attend and half intended to skip. He needed supplies. He had no opinion about the town. Then he saw the sign, "Murderess." He reined in his horse, a gray gelding named nothing in particular, just the horse, and read the sign twice. It was nailed above the door of what appeared to be a private residence, not a jailhouse. The curtains were gone from the windows. The door was nailed shut. He sat in the saddle for a moment. Around him, the town continued its business. A man swept a porch and kept his eyes on the boards. Two women crossed the street without glancing up. Cal dismounted. He tied the horse to the hitching post and walked to the side window. He looked in. Violet looked back at him. She did not beg. She did not cry. She was pale from the heat, and her lips were cracked, and her hair had come half loose from its pins. And she looked at him with the steady, exhausted eyes of someone who had spent 3 days watching people choose not to see her. "Are you the law?" she asked. "No," he said. "Then there's nothing you can do." Cal looked at the rope around her wrists, at the nailed door, at the sign above it. He looked back at her. "Who put that sign up?" "Judge Ord." A pause. "His nephew poisoned my husband and told the judge it was me." Cal was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What's your name?" "Violet Crane." He nodded slowly. He walked back around to the front of the house and looked at the nails in the door. There were 4 of them, driven in at angles, the work of someone in a hurry or someone who wanted it to look more official than it was. He went to his saddlebag and came back with a pry bar. The first nail came out with a sound like a small shot, and everyone on the main street of Harrow's Bluff heard it and went still. Cal worked steadily. He was not a dramatic man. He did not look around to see who was watching. He pulled the second nail, then the third. When he pulled the fourth, the door swung inward on its own. The inside of the house smelled like heat and dust, and the faint mineral smell of old fear. He found Violet in the back room and cut the rope at her wrists with his pocket knife. Her hands were swollen and the skin was rubbed raw. She didn't make a sound about it. She stood carefully, testing her legs. She was steadier than he expected. "You'll want to leave town," he said. "I can take you as far as—" "I'm not leaving," Violet said. He looked at her. "Edmund is buried here," she said. "And Fletcher Ord is still here. And the truth is still here." She met his eyes directly. "I am not leaving until my name is cleared." Cal studied her for a long moment. Behind him, through the open front door, he could hear boots on the boardwalk. Someone running. He had maybe 2 minutes before Deputy Harlan Price arrived to remind him of what he'd done. "You'll need somewhere to stay," he said. "They'll re-nail that door the moment I ride out." Violet straightened her dress as best she could with swollen hands. "Do you have somewhere in mind, or are you asking?" "I have a camp 2 miles east," Cal said. "It's not a house. I've slept rougher." Deputy Harlan Price appeared in the doorway, just as Cal was handing Violet her coat from the hook by the door. The one thing Fletcher hadn't taken, perhaps because it was plain and worn and worth nothing. Price was 26, broad in the shoulders, and wore the expression of a man trying to decide how much trouble this was going to be for him personally. "Merritt," Price said. Apparently someone had told him Cal's name, which meant someone in town knew him. "Judge Ord wants that woman. Her name," Cal said, "is Violet Crane." Price shifted his weight. "He wants her back in custody. On what charge? Murder. Has she been tried?" A pause. "There'll be a hearing." "Then there's no conviction," Cal said. "And if there's no conviction, she's not a prisoner, she's a citizen." He picked up Violet's coat and held it out to her. "If Judge Ord wants to hold a legal hearing, we'll attend." Price looked between them. His hand moved toward his holster and then moved back. The town was watching. Half of Harrow's Bluff could see through that open front door. And Price knew something Cal had already understood. A deputy who shot an unarmed woman's liberator in front of witnesses, in a town that was already quietly ashamed of what it had allowed, was going to have a much worse week than a deputy who stepped aside. Price stepped aside. Cal led Violet out of the house and down the porch steps and through the main street of Harrow's Bluff, and the town watched them go without a word. At his camp, Cal made a fire and boiled water and found a clean cloth in his kit, and Violet sat on a flat rock and let him wrap her wrists without comment. Her hands were steady. He noticed that. He noticed also that she did not fill the silence the way frightened people sometimes did, with words piled up to keep the dark back. She sat quietly and watched the fire and let the evening come. "How long had you been in there?" he asked. 3 days. Did anyone come?" She was quiet for a moment. "A boy brought water through the window. Mrs. Adeline Pratt's boy." A pause. "I don't know if she sent him or if he came on his own." Cal looked at the fire. He thought about Robbie, who had been the kind of boy who would have come on his own. He looked away from that thought and came back to the present. "Tell me what happened," he said, "from the beginning." Violet told him. She told it plainly, without embellishment or self-pity, the way a person tells something they've been waiting a long time to have the chance to say. Edmund's cousin Fletcher, who'd always wanted the copper claim. The supper Edmund had eaten at the Ord house the week before he died. The strange argument she'd overheard between Fletcher and Edmund 2 days before. Fletcher's voice low and tight. Edmund's confused and then frightened. The way Edmund had been sick only twice, both times after visiting the Ord house, before the final night when he did not recover. Fletcher had access to the house, she said. He came and went as he pleased. Edmund trusted him. Her voice stayed level. "I didn't touch Edmund's food. I didn't purchase anything that could have been used. But Fletcher knew where I kept the household accounts. And he also knew I had no father in this county, and no lawyer, and no one who would stand up in a room with the judge and call him a liar." Cal stared at the fire. "Is there anyone who saw something? Who knew something and didn't speak?" Violet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Pratt. She does laundry for the Ord house. She would have seen Fletcher's things." A pause. "The supply clerk at Gunder's. His name is Wiley Marsh. Fletcher bought something from him 2 weeks before Edmund died. I saw the receipt in Fletcher's coat pocket when the coat was left on our porch. I didn't know what it meant then, what was on the receipt. A chemical compound. Rat poison, I thought, though the quantity was strange for a rat problem." She looked at him. "I should have known. I kept thinking I must be wrong about Fletcher." "Most people do," Cal said. "Keep thinking they must be wrong about people like that." She looked at him steadily. "You sound like someone who's made that mistake." He didn't answer. But he didn't deny it either. The next morning, Cal rode back into Harrow's Bluff alone. He had business of a particular kind. The kind that required patience and a quiet manner, and the ability to let a person talk themselves into something they'd been wanting to say for a while. He went first to the assay office, where Hector Blythe sat behind his scale and looked like a man expecting bad news. "I'm not here about the claim," Cal said. He sat down uninvited and put his hat on his knee. "I'm here because I think you know something about Edmund Crane that you haven't said." Hector stared at his scale. He was a small man, precise, the kind who kept his accounts to the penny and his conscience in similar order, which meant Cal had found that men like Hector were often more troubled by dishonesty than they appeared. "Fletcher Ord came in here 3 weeks before Edmund died," Cal said. "It was not quite a guess, and whatever he said, it troubled you." Hector's hands went very still on the desk. "I'm not from this town," Cal said. "I have no debts to Ord and no claims in this county. I have nothing to protect and nothing to lose." He paused. "But Violet Crane does." Hector Blythe looked out the window for a long time. Then he said, "Fletcher came in to ask about the assay on Edmund's claim. He wanted to know the value." He stopped. "He told me Edmund was going to sell. He said he was helping Edmund handle the transaction." Another pause. "Edmund never came to me about any sale, and the week after, Edmund was dead." "Will you say that?" Cal asked. "In front of the town?" Hector looked at his hands. "Ord holds my license renewal." "I know," Cal said. "I'm asking anyway." A long silence. "Come back tomorrow," Hector said finally. "Let me think." Cal went next to Gunder's Supply. Wiley Marsh was a young man, barely 20, with ink-stained fingers, and the look of someone who had been carrying something uncomfortable for weeks. He confirmed the receipt before Cal had finished asking the question, as though the words had been waiting behind his teeth and only needed the door opened. Fletcher Ord purchased 2 ounces of arsenic trioxide on July 9th, Wiley said. He told me it was for vermin in the mine shaft. I wrote it down. His voice dropped. I always write it down, every transaction, because someday somebody might need to know. Cal looked at him. Why didn't you say so? Wiley looked at his ledger. Because Judge Ord is the one who decides if this store keeps its supply contract with the county. And I have a mother and 2 younger sisters. He met Cal's eyes. But I kept the record. Keep it safe, Cal said. He found Adeline Pratt at her laundry, behind the building, where the steam rose in white columns into the dry August air. She was a broad, capable woman with reddened arms and an expression that had gone guarded the moment she saw him coming. I know why you're here, she said before he spoke. Then you know what I'm going to ask. Adeline wrung out a shirt with the efficiency of a woman who had wrung out 10,000 shirts and would wring out 10,000 more. I wash for the Ord house twice a week. I have for 6 years. She hung the shirt without looking at him. 3 weeks ago, I found Fletcher Ord's good linen coat with a stain on the left sleeve, brownish, chemical. She reached for the next shirt, and a tear in the pocket lining, like something small and heavy, had been carried there and had worn through the thread. Cal was still. A vial, he said. Adeline's jaw tightened. I don't speculate. But you'll describe what you saw. She was quiet for so long that a mockingbird landed on the fence rail beside her and sang 3 different songs before she answered. My boy Pete went to that window on his own, she said. I didn't send him, but I didn't stop him either. She took a breath. I have 5 children and a house that sits on ground leased from Ord's land office. Her voice was flat. Tell me what it costs to speak, Mr. Merritt. Tell me what happens to my children's beds. I can't promise you nothing happens, Cal said. I won't lie to you. He looked at her steadily. But I will tell you this. Violet Crane has already lost more than a house, and she's still standing. And if the truth comes out and you stayed quiet, you'll know that for the rest of your life. He let that sit for a moment. You know what that feels like. You've known it for weeks. Adeline set down the shirt she was holding and looked at the steam rising from the vats. There was one more thing, she said quietly. In the pocket of that coat, a paper. A letter folded small. I didn't read it. But the name on the outside, she stopped. It was Edmund's handwriting, and it was addressed to Judge Ord. Cal went very still. Where is it now? I put it back, she said. I was afraid. A pause. But I remember what it looked like. That may be enough, he said. Will you speak? Adeline Pratt looked at the washing line, heavy with other people's clothes. Yes, she said. God help me. Yes. That evening, Cal came back to the camp and told Violet what he'd found. She sat across the fire from him and listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Edmund wrote to the judge, she said slowly, before he died. It sounds like he suspected something, Cal said. Maybe he was trying to address it quietly, through official channels. He would have done that, Violet said. Her voice was soft. He always believed in addressing things quietly, through the right people. She looked at the fire. He didn't know Ord was the wrong person. Cal watched her face. There was grief in it, but not the shattering kind. The kind that has had time to settle into the shape of who you are now. I'm sorry about your husband, he said. Violet looked at him. I'm sorry about your son, she said. He had not told her about Robbie. He didn't know what expression had given it away, only that she had seen it, and she had named it without flinching, and somehow that was easier to bear than the silence he'd been carrying for 2 years. He looked at the fire for a long time. Robbie, he said. It came out without choking. That was the first time in 2 years that his son's name had come out without choking. Violet did not say she was sorry again. She just nodded and let the name stand there in the air between them, acknowledged and real. They went into Harrow's Bluff together on a Saturday, which was market day, when the freighters came through and the claims men came down from the hills and the main street filled with more people than the town usually held. Cal had chosen Saturday deliberately. He wanted witnesses. Judge Prentice Ord was on the steps of the meeting hall when they rode in, as though he'd been told to expect them, which Cal suspected he had. Fletcher Ord stood at his uncle's right hand wearing a new coat, not blue brocade, brown wool, but new. The town went quiet. Ord lifted his voice, and it carried like a man who had long ago learned to use a room. "Violet Crane," he said. "You've been released from lawful custody by an outside agitator who has no standing in this county. I'm ordering you returned." "On what charge?" Violet asked. Her voice was clear and steady and carried just as far. She stepped forward, not toward Ord, toward the gathered crowd. "I have not been tried. I have not been convicted. My husband is dead and I am a widow, and I am standing in the street of the town where I have lived for 3 years. And I am asking, what is the charge?" Ord's face went hard. "The charge is murder. The evidence was presented by the man who committed the crime," Violet said. Fletcher's jaw tightened. The crowd saw it. "Edmund Crane did not die by my hand," Violet said. She reached into the front of her coat and withdrew something, a folded paper. "He died trying to report what he feared to a man he trusted. This is a copy of that letter." Edmund had a second copy made, in the office of a notary in Elko, before he ever sent the original. She looked at Ord. "He was thorough, my husband. You may have missed that about him." The paper had taken 2 days to obtain. Cal had ridden to Elko himself, while Violet stayed at camp with a borrowed rifle and instructions she had not needed. The notary had kept the copy exactly as Edmund had left it. Edmund had known, at the end, what Fletcher was. He had been trying to find a way to prove it without destroying the peace of the family that remained. He had been too careful, too slow, and it had cost him his life. But he had been thorough. Ord stared at the paper. The color went out of his face. "What does it say?" Someone in the crowd called out. "It describes a conversation Edmund overheard." Violet said, "Between Fletcher Ord and a man named Gerard Vick, who runs the freight wagons for the county. It describes a plan to take Edmund's copper claim through false debt and, if that failed, through—" She stopped for just a moment. "Through other means. Edmund names the means. He names the substance. He names where it would have to be obtained." She looked at Wiley Marsh, standing near the supply house door. "And who obtained it?" Wiley stepped forward. He was shaking, but he stepped forward. "I have the record," he said. "Fletcher Ord purchased 2 ounces of arsenic trioxide on July 9th. I have the date, the amount, and his signature." Hector Blythe came forward next. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was relieved to have made it. "Fletcher came to my office and told me Edmund was planning to sell the claim. Edmund never came to me. I believe Fletcher was laying the groundwork to present a false sale after Edmund was dead." Then Adeline Pratt walked through the crowd, still in her work apron, her hands red from the washwater. "I found that coat," she said. "The stain on the sleeve, the torn pocket, and the letter in the pocket that Fletcher was carrying. The letter Edmund had sent to the judge, which Fletcher must have intercepted before it arrived." She looked at Ord directly. "Which means you never read it. Which means you condemned this woman on your nephew's word alone." The crowd turned toward Fletcher Ord. Fletcher looked like a man whose fine clothes had just stopped fitting him. He took 1 step backward and then stopped because there was nowhere useful to go. Ord raised his voice. These are fabrications, arranged by an outside agitator with no standing." "My name is Calvin Merritt," Cal said. He had been quiet through all of it, standing slightly behind Violet, and he spoke now without raising his voice. "I have brokered cattle contracts in 6 counties, and my reputation is known from Elko to Carson City. I have no debt in this county and no claim on this land. I stopped here because I saw a woman accused without a trial and left in a rope in her own house." He looked at the crowd. "I have nothing to gain from this. I'd like to think that ought to mean something." Deputy Harlan Price stood near the edge of the crowd. He was very still. "Price," Ord said sharply. The deputy did not move. "Harlan." Ord's voice dropped to something older and harder, the voice underneath the official voice. "You know what you owe me." Price looked at Violet Crane, standing in the street of Harrow's Bluff with her damaged wrists and her clear eyes, and the letter that her dead husband had been careful enough to copy twice. He looked at the crowd of people who had watched him look the other way for 3 days. He looked at Fletcher Ord, who was already calculating exits. "Fletcher Ord," Price said, and his voice was not entirely steady, but it was loud enough. "You're under arrest for the murder of Edmund Crane." Fletcher ran. He made it approximately 15 feet before 2 cattlemen from the Friday market caught him by the arms and held him without ceremony in the middle of the street. The crowd erupted. It was not the clean, righteous roar of a story. It was messier than that. There were people who shouted, and people who wept, and people who simply stood there looking at the ground because they were thinking about the 3 days they had walked past that window. There was a man who turned to Ord and started talking, loudly, about a freight contract that had been changed without his agreement. There was a woman who listed, clearly and specifically, the amount she had overpaid on a water lease for 4 years. There was Otis, not Otis, but Hector, already back at his assay scale, pulling out records he had kept carefully for years. The same careful precision that had made him good at his job now turned toward the accounting of someone else's crimes. As for Judge Prentice Ord, he stood on the meeting hall steps and watched the town that had feared him for 2 decades stop doing so, which is not a thing that happens all at once. It happens in pieces, one person at a time, each one slightly braver than the last, because someone ahead of them had gone first. By the time the afternoon was over, Ord was still standing on those steps, but no one was looking to him for permission anymore. That, in its way, was a more complete undoing than anything a court could have ordered. A circuit judge arrived from Reno 12 days later. He reviewed the notarized letter, the supply records, Adeline's testimony, Hector's documentation, and the transcript of Fletcher's arrest. He also reviewed, with some care, the conduct of Judge Prentice Ord in the matter of Violet Crane's detention. Fletcher Ord was tried and convicted of the murder of Edmund Crane. He was sentenced to 20 years in the Nevada State Penitentiary. In the sentencing, the judge noted specifically that the accused had allowed an innocent woman to suffer 3 days of unlawful imprisonment and public humiliation while possessing full knowledge of her innocence. Judge Prentice Ord was removed from the bench and his landholdings were placed under review by the county. It took 18 months for the full accounting, but most of it came back wrong. Inflated debts, altered lease records, water rights that had been registered twice. He did not go to prison. He went to his sister's house in Sacramento and did not return to Nevada. Harrow's Bluff reclaimed its water rights in the spring of 1891, and the first thing the town did with the newly managed resource was run a pipe to the school. Violet Crane's name was cleared in open court, read aloud by the circuit judge on a Tuesday morning in September, with most of Harrow's Bluff present. She stood in the front row and heard her name spoken cleanly, without the word murderess attached to it, and she let herself close her eyes for just a moment. A name was a small thing until someone tried to take it. Then it turned out to be nearly everything. Adeline Pratt organized a supper at the meeting hall that evening. She did it without asking anyone's permission, which was new for her. She simply told people when and what to bring, and they came, which was also new. Pete Stills, her son, sat at the end of the table beside Wiley Marsh, who turned out to be good company once he wasn't carrying a secret. At some point in the evening, Adeline came to stand beside Violet and said quietly, "I should have done more. Sooner." Violet looked at her. "You raised a boy who brought water to a stranger," she said. "That was not nothing." Adeline pressed her lips together and looked away. But some of what she'd been carrying since July lightened visibly and did not come back in quite the same form. Wiley kept his supply records even more meticulously after that. It became something of a known quality about him, the kind of careful documentation that made people trust him. He ran Gunder's Supply for another 30 years and trained 3 clerks who each kept records the same way. Hector Blythe retired at 62 and left his assay records to the County Historical Archive. There is a notation in the margin of one of his 1889 ledgers, in his precise hand. Spoke the truth when it mattered. Oct. 1889. He never explained it to anyone. He didn't need to. The copper claim, Edmund Crane's claim, passed to Violet outright, as it always should have. She hired 2 men to work it through the fall, took a fair return, and the following spring sold it at a proper price to a mining company out of San Francisco that was unlikely to be related to anyone in Harrow's Bluff by blood. Cal Merritt did not leave Harrow's Bluff immediately. He extended his camp into the second week, and then, because the broker meeting in Carson City had come and gone without him, and no one had appeared to particularly notice, into the third, he repaired 2 fence lines at the edge of town for the cost of the wire. He replaced a collapsed section of the livery roof. He was useful in the way of a man who has forgotten how to sit still and has stopped pretending otherwise. Violet had moved back into her house. Her house, properly, now that the false claim against her had been dismissed. She replanted the small garden that had gone to weeds in August. She opened the windows in the morning and kept them open. She did not ask Cal to stay, and she did not ask him to go. One evening in October, when the desert had turned cold after dark and the stars were very clear, Cal came to the porch with 2 cups of coffee and sat down on the step beside her without asking, which she had noticed was how he approached most things. Not dramatically, not with announcement, simply by doing the thing and seeing what happened. "I have a parcel of land east of Elko," he said. "I know," Violet said. "You've mentioned it. I haven't decided what to do with it." She looked at the street where a lamp burned outside the supply house. Wiley had started keeping it lit at night. It was a small thing. "Neither have I," Violet said. "Decided what to do, with a lot of things." Cal drank his coffee. The desert made its small nighttime sounds around them. "I'm not a simple man to know," he said. "I don't talk much. I'm better at fixing what's broken than at other things. I've noticed that." "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I just want to be clear about what you'd be if you were." He stopped. Started again. "I'm saying I know what I am." Violet looked at him. In the lamplight, he looked like what he was. A man who had carried a great weight for a long time, and had recently set some of it down and was still figuring out how to walk without it. "I know what you are too," she said. "You're the man who stopped." He looked at her. "Anyone could have stopped," she said. "Plenty of people rode past. You stopped." She looked back at the street. "That tells me most of what I need to know." They sat on the porch until the cold drove them inside. That was in its way a beginning. They married the following spring, in the yard of the house in Harrow's Bluff, that had once had a sign nailed above its door, on a morning when the desert was in brief and extravagant bloom, and Adeline Pratt cried through the vows, and Pete stood beside Cal, and Wiley brought a cake that was slightly uneven and tasted very good. Hector Blythe attended and shook Cal's hand for a long time without speaking, which Cal understood perfectly. Violet wore a dress the color of copper, not mourning and not victory, just the color of the land where she had survived something and chosen to stay. They made their life at the parcel east of Elko, in a house that had been quiet too long and benefited from the opening of windows. They kept a lamp burning outside most nights, not because anyone asked them to. Because it turned out they both believed in that kind of thing, the small light in the dark that says someone is here, and you are not as alone as you think. Years later, people in Harrow's Bluff still talked about the summer of 1889, not with pride, but with the particular honesty of people who have looked at the worst version of themselves and decided to be different. They talked about the woman who came back and stood in the street and said her name. They talked about the quiet man with the pry bar who stopped when no one else did. And sometimes they talked about what it really costs to look away. Not the dramatic cost. Not the cost that arrives all at once, but the smaller one. The one you pay in pieces, morning after morning, until the day someone gives you a chance to do differently. and you find out whether you take it. Most of them, when it mattered, had taken it. That, in the end, was what they wanted to be remembered for. Not what they had done wrong in August, but what they had chosen to do right in September when the chance came. Because fear can hold a town the same as it holds a person, tight and quiet and convinced that the cost of speaking is too high. But truth has a way of finding the one door that was left unlocked, and once it walks through, it tends to stay.